On behalf of the American Culture and Literature Department, I would like to welcome you to the 12th World Congress of the International American Studies Association. We are delighted to host you here at Hacettepe University. I believe it will be a wonderful opportunity for us and our students to broaden our horizons, exchange ideas, and inspire new academic and cultural collaborations. I'd like to begin by sharing a few words about our department. Established in 1982, our Department of American Culture and Literature is the first American Studies department in Turkey. Currently, we have 14 academic staff members, specializing in areas such as literary theory, poetry, theater, life writing, Native American, Vietnamese American, African American, and Jewish American literatures, science fiction and fantasy, gender studies, disability studies, and eco-criticism. In addition to our commitment to research and teaching, we provide many opportunities for our students to engage in extracurricular activities. We regularly organize online and in-person seminars, allowing our students to learn from scholars beyond their instructors. Each year, we hold a one-day conference where faculty members share their work they presented elsewhere. Our students are also active in film groups, developing skills in scriptwriting, editing, filmmaking, and they organize career events to connect with alumni and explore post-graduation opportunities. Since its founding, the department has been particularly active in theater production. Through our student theater group, we have staged numerous productions in English. Our students were also actively involved in the preparations for this conference. You'll see several of them here today serving as conference assistants. They are wearing name tags with red cords. Please don't hesitate to contact them if you have any questions or requests. Now, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Bilge Mutlay Çetintaş, Chair of the Department of American Culture and Literature, to deliver the opening speech. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello and welcome, and as you all know, I have a double role. I'm the chair of the Department of American Culture and Literature, and I'm also the president of IASA for the moment. So, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, welcome to the 12th World Congress of International American Studies. This year is a milestone. It's the 25th anniversary of IASA, which is important. We are very lucky that Celal Kadir, our founding father, is with us this time. It's a pleasure to see him and all of you here in Ankara. I will be speaking in my double role, as I have just said, as an IASA president and the chair of the Department of American Culture and Literature, which is the host institution of this Congress. I hope you will enjoy the academic discussions and exchanges we will be having during these 3 days. As you can see from the Congress program, we will be having 96 in-person and online presentations in total. The presenters in this Congress come from 17 different countries: Austria, Germany, Bulgaria, Britain, Brazil, Canada, China, Greece, Hungary, India, Italy, Norway, Poland, Spain, Turkey, Ukraine, and United States, and I hope I'm not missing any of the countries. Diversity is always important for IASA, and that's why it's called the International American Studies Association. The Article 1 of our bylaws underlines the importance of such diverse exchanges in the following manner, and I'm quoting: "The object of International American Studies Association shall be to further the international exchange of ideas and information among scholars from all nations and various disciplines who study and teach America regionally, hemispherically, nationally, and transnationally." Please allow me to briefly sketch the petite history of this Congress. When the current IASA board started to envision this Congress, a number of subjects would garner interest. We were looking for a theme that would garner interest from several academic fields. The original idea came from our much creative former president, Pavel Yenjeko, and fine-tuned by our vice president, Gabriela Vargas Cetina, and our emerging scholar coordinator, George Top. Of course, my dear colleagues Tanfer Emin Tunç and Cem Kılıçaslan Hoca also contributed to the call of the papers as the host department. As the host institution, we started our preparations and searched for a visual that would represent the Congress in Ankara. We decided to utilize a very well-known Anatolian mosaic on the permanent display collection of Zeugma Museum in Gaziantep. The Gypsy Girl, the one that you are seeing over there. You see this image in several different versions as items in your Congress pack. The Gypsy Girl is quite well known in Turkey, and the image has been reproduced several times, mostly in tourist brochures and other promotions. The image is often dubbed as the Turkish Mona Lisa because it utilizes the same kind of ambiguous look, both inside and outside the frame. Yet, the story surrounding the mosaic is far more interesting than its popularity. Pieces of the mosaic were found in the ancient city of Zeugma in Turkey's Gaziantep province in 1998 when an ancient column which had fallen down was lifted. However, the rest of the mosaic pieces, which were not under the column, have been found during the unauthorized excavations in 1960s and smuggled abroad. Bowling Green State University in Ohio brought these mosaics for $35,000 and exhibited them in their museum. A research conducted by Stephanie Hopper in 2012 revealed that the mosaics were originally from Zeugma. The report prepared the same year proved that the mosaic pieces were the stolen parts of the Gypsy Girl. And Turkey, as a result, officially requested the return of these pieces. After 5.5 years of negotiations, Turkish Culture and Tourism Ministry and the Bowling Green State University signed a protocol in 2018 regarding the return of the mosaic pieces. Now, these pieces are being exhibited temporarily in Zeugma Mosaic Museum in Gaziantep, in Turkey. They are planned to be restored to their original setting later. Thus, the Gypsy Girl mosaic represents the idea of IASA mission statement I quoted earlier, an artwork that bridges the past and the present and yields itself to the study of national and transnational negotiations. By the way, if you roam around this beautiful campus at some time, you will also come across the replica of the Gypsy Girl on the main library building. And I should also thank Sıla Çetintaş, my daughter, for using this image in such a creative fashion on our Congress poster and elsewhere on the Congress pass. Thank you, sir. Preparing a Congress or any similar event is not easy, as many of you who have organized such events probably know. It takes a village, as they say, to nourish a child, or a Congress in this case. Yet, the village was always affected by the politics and debates around the related issues. And naturally, forces and developments beyond our control affect our microcosms. In this sense, if the Congress had a theme song, it could be Against All Odds, which is a song by English drummer, singer, and songwriter Phil Collins, recorded for the soundtrack of the 1984 film with the same name. The Congress happened, despite our own institution's new restrictive rules and regulations on hosting congresses and cutting budgets. It happened despite losing the possible grant from the US State Department because Trump's new policy was not favoring diversity, inclusivity, equity any longer. It happened despite Erdogan's recent move to confiscate the mayor of Istanbul, his major opponent and the next presidential candidate, with favorable polls. The following peaceful protests resulted in a number of other unjust incarcerations and alerted some European countries to issue travel warnings for Turkey, which unfortunately affected 12 in-person participants of this Congress. The Congress happened despite a recent large earthquake in Istanbul, although fortunately the tremors did not cause any damage or casualties. And lastly, it happened despite the Kashmir situation, which once again stirred the conflict between India and Pakistan. We have 6 very brave Indian colleagues who came despite all odds and killed the Pakistan. Yet, I would also like to think that the Congress is happening now because the dedication of the colleagues on board, Gabby, Stefan, Pavel, George, Ishtirak, and our very efficient secretary, Maria, as well as all the members of the Department of American Culture and Literature, as well as our dear students.
Here, here.
You will hopefully have a chance to speak and exchange ideas. Well, IASA has always been relying on its own resources. So has Department of American Culture and Literature. So it seems like this is a match made in heaven. So we relied on our own resources to make this happen. Once again, please enjoy and make the most out of it. Making friends and establishing networks have always been one of IASA's strong suit. I am sure we will continue this tradition against all odds. Thank you.
Professor Çetintaş. Now I'd like to invite Professor Pavel Yanjeko to moderate the keynote address and Professor Celal Kadir to deliver his keynote speech titled Imagining America, the Road Not Taken and the Triumph of Optics.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be here in Hacettepe once again. This is my second time and I'm loving it, absolutely. But the most important thing for me right now is to tell you how honored I am to be able to introduce Professor Celal Kadir. And obviously I could talk about his academic achievements, his 12 plus books, countless articles, including the ones we've written together. But the most important thing is that Professor Kadir has this absolutely unique ability to change the optics of a large number of people, and that creates things, that makes things happen. Many years ago, Professor Kadir and a group of his colleagues who are much more senior than we are, and this group included such brilliant people as Emery Elliott, for instance, Theo Don, and a number of other people, including our own Giorgio Mariani. These people have revised the way Americas are being looked at. Basically, since 1945, as you very well know, the public diplomacy of the United States has created a network of American Studies associations, all of them sponsored by the State Department. All of them focusing on the United States of America, sometimes critically, sometimes not. That wasn't really terribly important since World War II, because that was about the building of a certain image of the United States. So it was strictly US oriented, and if any excursions were made intellectually to the north or to the south, that would be rare. Professor Kadir and his colleagues, who were the absolute creme de la creme of the American community at the time, have resolved that this is no longer working. And the comparative studies that have been budding at that time, and I'm talking about the mid to late 90s, have transformed into the only association at the time that would treat the Americas as communicating vessels. So no longer would you look at America, meaning the United States of America, to study it from the perspective of history, from the perspective of the literary scholarship, cultural studies, sociology, anthropology, and so on and so forth. You'd see that every single stone dropped in the pond to the south is going to produce ripples that are going to affect the very north. And actually, by extension, that also works with the Atlantic and Trans-Pacific relations. We are talking about a very complex set of relationships, and you cannot reduce the study of America to the United States of America. This is what we did. That doesn't mean that we do not offer any insights into the United States. Of course we do. It is a donor culture after all, which affects many of the acceptor cultures, and whatever happens in the States affects us. For instance, truly yours, in all probability, will have to abstain from going to America for the next 6 years for being short-fused about certain politicians at the very top of the U.S. administration right now. And I promise to control myself, and I will. Ladies and gentlemen, personally, I am very heavily indebted to Professor Kadir, because when I was still a completely stupid, unimportant wannabe of American studies, Professor Kadir's antithetical muse, Juanita Celia Kadir, actually embraced me as an Americanist during a Melville Society conference, following which I received like 4 big boxes of Americanist books and articles, which in the mid-90s were simply unavailable. Listen, people, there was a time before the cell phone and the internet. And if you were from a communist country like I was, and it only ended to be communist in 1989, it was a hell of a problem to get Americanist books. And I wouldn't have become an academic if not for Juanita. And Juanita is no longer with us, and she was a very dear, dear friend of ours, and Jalal's absolute muse. Jalal's new book is dedicated to solitude, and you probably can draw conclusions as to why. The book is coming out soon. We're crossing our fingers, keeping our fingers crossed for the book to come out soon and to be distributed worldwide. But the most important part of it is that right thereafter, so 4 years after Bellagio, when IASA came into existence, and 3 years after September 11, when our independence proved to be pretty important, because when we are independent financially from the country who's the aggressor, whom we criticize, whose administration we criticize, we can hardly count on being subsidized, or we can hardly count on the objectivity of academic research if you're under pressure as, because sometimes we participate in the activities of IASA, but also we perform functions in our own universities. So, for instance, if I criticize America too heavily, then my own boss, my dean, my rector, might actually cut my funds because I misrepresent the intentions of the university. Well, this is all true. IASA gave us this freedom. We could be honest about our insights. And this is all owing to Jalal Kadir, who never gives up on anything. And believe you me, he only looks like a sweet little bear who's really cute, but when he gets angry, he speaks the truth, and he will dish it out in your face. And he invited me to a rather mere Center for American Studies at Oxford University, where we met in person, and this kick-started this, RIAS, the Review of International American Studies, which is our flagship journal. Scope was listed, 70 parametric points in the whole industry, Class A journal in Italy, a journal which is yours. It's not mine, it's not his, it's yours. But most importantly, he made me an emerging scholar want to do more. And this is what trickled down through me and Georgie and Bilge to every emerging scholar here. Don't be afraid to do research. Don't be afraid to speak the truth. And never be afraid of resisting the fascists, because the worst thing that may happen is compliance. Jalal has never been compliant, and this is the figure I'd like to introduce today. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Jalal.
Okay, we can go home now. such a wonderful introduction. I can't wait to hear what I have to say. But I must begin by commending the hosts, especially Julia Hanna and her team, for the wonderful job that they have done in organizing this conference under very difficult circumstances. We are honored to be Turkey and that this particular institution, the foremost university in the country. Thank you very much. I took the title of this Congress as articulated by the wonderful organizing committee. Bent it somehow, as is our custom really, not to take anything too straight, too literally. So my title is Imaging America, the Road Not Taken and the Triumph of Optics. It has an epigraph from the poet Robert Frost. The land was ours before we were the land's. I'll get back to that in due course. The principal question that I asked myself in composing this address is, what could a diagnostic imaging by the light of American studies reveal about America in this third decade of the 21st century? Thank you very much.
Is it on? Is the mic on?
Yes, it's on. How about this? Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I tend to speak rather softly, and I don't carry any sticks. And what might be the state of American studies as a discipline, as an investigative instrument, and as a pedagogical field under the circumstances? Image has always been paramount in the history of America, starting with the imaginaries that underwrote the transatlantic voyages that began in 1492, and the philological punning of the Benedictine monk cartographer Martin Waldseeger in 1507 that gave the newly encountered territories the name of America, literally no place as played with Americo Vespucci's name and Aristotle's Ameros. The founding of the International American Studies Association in 2020 was an inevitable result of historical imperatives that made the examination of the relationship between image and reality compelling. As the field struggled to maintain some sense of intellectual integrity beyond the echo chamber of Washington, D.C. and its satellites, the founding of IASA became a necessity at the turn of the century. 25 years later, with reality more moot and image more problematic, the task of American studies proves even more complex and the state of the discipline more critical than ever. IASA's role as a quarter century after its founding, as an attempt to broaden the conversation and sustain the intellectual integrity of the scholarly endeavor, is as crucial in 2025 as it was indispensable in 2000. IASA's founding was critical in changing the conversation on America and in American studies. Since then, America has changed, and our conversation as Americans has to continue changing accordingly. The theme of IASA's 12th World Congress in Ankara today aptly and insightfully reflects this change, and the organizers of this Congress must be commended for their comprehension and cutting-edge responsiveness to the realities of the profession and its field of study. The triumph of optics and image as substance and the industrialization of imaging through the corporate mass media, mediatic social sphere, marketing consultants, mercenary influence makers, and their underwriters have achieved the consummate mediatization of reality. The image-making and optics management industry operates as a highly profitable monopoly on what is deemed to be real. The public sphere and its conversation are dominated and capitalized by a self-selected few. As US Senator Bernie Sanders points out at the end of 2024, 6 huge media corporations now own what American people and, by extension, the rest of the world see, hear, and read. Media and strategically mediated reality then are now preeminent, and their optic renditions as controlled narrative or as pixelated image are the new reality, often glossed as ultimate reality, or as reality show, purporting to be more real than the reality it has displaced, and even more real than its own self-reflexively deployed ironies of performative self-effacement. The sleight of hand stratagems of that process are cleverly contrived and targeted to purpose through tightly controlled and ubiquitously controlling algorithms. Our understanding of reality then calls for a new epistemology, since our perception of what might be real is now conditioned by imaging and by the industrialized production of visual simulacra and narrative simulations. You might recall these terms from the French social philosopher and cultural critic Jean Baudrillard and his insightfully prescient 1981 treatise Simulacre et Simulation. While the process described by Baudrillard is constantly ongoing, now, in the year 2025, we find ourselves at what he described as the fourth and culminating phase, which is the governing stage of simulation. That procession, as you might recall Baudrillard's term, begins with mimetic representation of reality, then the masking of the reality represented, followed by the occlusion of the masking of the absence of reality, and finally, the severance of any relationship between image and any reality, except the reality of the simulacrum itself. In the end, simulation is rendered indistinguishable from dissimulation. The cybernetic digitization of the process renders its prestidigitation and sleight of hand more efficient, more effective, more far-reaching, and more consequential than ever. In some instances, with the recent eminence of artificial intelligence, more deadly than ever. This is not a purely rhetorical governing principle. It is, rather, the actual ruling axiom of government and governance. If one has any doubt about this, all one has to do is recall the most recent US presidential election and its aftermath. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, online advertising in the 2024 election cycle topped $1.35 billion. The total spent on all forms of political advertising in 2024, according to Ad Impact, an ad tracking firm as reported by NBC News, was $11 billion. Political advertising is image making, visual and narrative, and manufactured them on an industrial scale. The magnates of that image making tech industry, now dubbed the oligarchs of a new gilded age, are at the forefront of image manufacturing, policy formation, and governance. Their role is graphically demonstrated by the position they occupied at the January 25, 2025 presidential inaugurations, front row and center, ahead of the new administration's cabinet nominees, a number of whom are tech billionaires in their own right. Those front row seats cost $1 million each, $750 million in the case of Elon Musk. But this is only a down payment for what is expected in return. In the particular case of Musk, the compensation for that political largesse has translated into the privilege of reorganizing and governing the governing structures of all governmental institutions in the name of efficiency, and coincidentally, the more efficient capitalization of government resources for maximal profitability of corporate interests. In America's history, the theoretical discourse on mediated industrialization of image and simulacra emerged as under the rubric of public relations. The term was coined by Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and an Austrian immigrant to the United States of America. Often called the high priest of Madison Avenue, the epicenter of the advertising industry in New York, Bernays initiated not only the discourse on mediatic industrialization, but he also launched the strategic and programmatic praxis. His life spanned the 20th century. He died in 1995 at the age of 103. His often cited works consist of such books as Crystallizing Public Opinion from 1923, Propaganda from 1928, and such seminal essays as The Marketing of National Policies, a study of war propaganda, that was published in the Journal of Marketing in 1942, and The Engineering of Consent in the Annals of American Academy of Political and Social Sciences in 1947. Some of you might recognize the last title in its 1988 avatar as Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, the title of the book by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. And for some of you, Bernays' phrase engineering consent and Herman and Chomsky's manufacturing consent might resonate with the earlier work of the Italian political philosopher Antonio Gramsci and his essays on hegemony, the state, and civil society that were published in his prison notebooks. Bernays was an analyst and master practitioner of simulation, dissimulation, and images simulacra. His legacy is now foundational for our mediatic age, and it is now more relevant than ever. Bernays not only studied and analyzed propaganda, he diligently and successfully engendered and deployed it. His historic successes include the advocacy of war and his militant intervention in the debate that pushed the United States into World War I. He became a Latin America's specialist of sorts. His public relations on behalf of the United Fruit Company, now called Chiquita, successfully fomented the bloody military coup and CIA-sponsored regime change in Guatemala in 1954 that overthrew the democratically elected government. And his stunningly successful advertising images, visual and verbal, on behalf of the American Tobacco Company in the cooptation of the women's movement, urged young women to take up smoking in 1929 by lighting up their cigarettes, which he dubbed torches of freedom. Though the technologies might be novel, and the consequences for planet Earth and human life of greater danger than ever, the dialectical counterpoint between reality and representation, or idea and image, is not new. You will recall Plato's dialogue, Eon, from the 4th century BC, around 380 BC, and the juxtaposition between mimesis and form. Plato's expressed admonition to Eon, the naive lecturer on poetry, is that representation, poetic or sculptural, painterly or linguistic, as inspired image, is not founded on knowledge or skill, though it can control thought and can undermine reason. Some 200 years before Plato, the question of the relationship between image and reality was already crucial. The Doric lyrical poet and chorus master, Stesichorus, retracted by way of a palinode in an encomium for Helen. In that corrective commendation, he declared that Helen was not responsible, after all, for the Trojan War and the destruction of King Priam's shining city, because she never sailed to Troy. In his retraction, Stesichorus clarified that it was really Helen's image, her eidolon, that was seen in Troy. His sight was duly restored by virtue of that belated insight. Since the Bronze Age Trojan War, sometime in the 13th or 12th century BC then, war and image coincide in parallel and mutually reinforcing simultaneity. Some of you might recall that our 21st century AD began with an honorable and decorated war veteran, General Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, in what subsequently proved to be a theatrical gesture of dissimulation before the Security Council of the United Nations, holding up a vial of supposed chemical of mass destruction, anthrax, before the eyes of the world as justification for the invasion of Iraq, the 21st century's first war of choice. As we, along with the good general, learned, that gesture proved to be a blatant act of dissimulation and a pretext for an elective war. One wonders what happens to the military honor of a decorated general and to the personal integrity of an honorable man compromised into such an act of simulation. The fate of military honor, personal integrity, and truth become entangled in the thicket of paradox some 16 years later, when Mike Pompeo, a graduate of West Point, the US Military Academy, and eventual successor of General Colin Powell, as Secretary of State in 2018. Mike Pompeo was much more forthright, though his frankness founders on paradox, what in the history of philosophy is known as the Epimenides paradox. You might recall the legendary, semi-mythical Epimenides of Knossos, Crete, who dates from the 7th or 6th century BC, and who is best remembered for what he is purported to have claimed as a Cretan about Cretans. Cretes aia studius, literally Cretans always liars, conventionally translated as Cretans are always liars. In April of 2019, engaged in a dialogue with students at the Texas A&M University, Pompeo noted, and I quote, "In terms of how you think about problem sets, When I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. That was like we had entire training courses. Close quote. Epimenides was a Cretan legendary figure. The truthfulness of his claim about Cretans has been dealt with as a paradox by philosophers, logicians for centuries. Pompeo is a trained warrior in wartime, retired from the US Army as an officer with the rank of captain, a member of the US House of Representatives from Kansas between 2011 and 2017, prior to being director of the CIA in 2018 and the top diplomat of his country a year later. He is our contemporary in the 21st century who confesses to having been trained to lie, to cheat, and to steal. How is the veracity of a claim by a trained liar to be assessed? What is the significance of any assertion in the context of simulation and dissimulation when a trained liar claims to be uttering a truth? Or is this a strategy designed to elicit questions that begs the question? A petitio principii, a tactical simulacrum. In times of war, image and dissimulation have always taken on greater urgency and wider significance. We, in the third decade of the 21st century, and since the founding of IASA a quarter century ago, have been living in a time of constant war. This is in keeping with America's historical precedent. As former President Jimmy Carter accurately pointed out, the United States of America has experienced only 16 years without war in its 242-year history. President Carter made that observation 6 years ago, and the past 6 years have not been any different in the history of what Carter called, quote, the most warlike nation in the history of the world. The bicontinental Western Hemisphere of the Americas likewise has lived in perennial war, chiefly because North America's wars have proved invariably to be wars that have had real and tangible repercussions in the rest of the American hemisphere. At present, American wars implicate not only the Americas, but they impact all other nations. Because in our age of globalization, those wars are globally repercussive, especially since war has now hybridized into economic as well as battlefield bellicosity with primary, secondary, and quantum sanctions, along with targeted reciprocal and compensatory tariffs reaching out to all corners of the world and its economies. Image, whether poetic, painterly, or pixelated, has been and continues to be central. The management of image in America is foundational. In the case of the US, it dates from June 1776, and the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Penned by Thomas Jefferson, it became the American creed, a credo founded expressly in what is to be seen, the visual, the evident. We hold this truth to be self-evident. Is a decameter, a line hectoring its image in trochaic rhythm, self-affirming and self-legitimating. By this reckoning, what is to be seen to be vident in its Latin derivation carries the tautological force of self-validating evidence. This is powerful image projection in self-affirming declaration. The prosody, a trochaic decameter, turns into an ideological decalogue, its 10 metric syllables have morphed into 10 commandments. Its self-evident foundational truth then begs the fundamental question: what is the nature of truth when it is claimed to be self-evident? At the heart of that question lies the relationship between truth and the evident. That is, what is to be seen, the visual, the image on the one hand, and actual reality on the other hand. And the truth of the matter is that at the heart of that relationship between truth and the evident lies a perennial disjunction. In the case of America, the bicontinental Western Hemisphere, that disjunction begins with the beginning of America as America. That is, with the first encounter between the European explorers and the topography and human geography of a place they dubbed a New World, which was only new to them, but in fact was already quite old in and of itself. In fact, as pointed out in Columbus and the Ends of the Earth, Europe's prophetic rhetoric as conquering ideology, a book of 1992, until his third voyage, Christopher Columbus had little comprehension of what he was seeing. He thought initially that he was somewhere else in Asia, in a world that was as old, if not older, than the world he came upon. By his third voyage, he was convinced he was east of Eden, the biblical Garden of Paradise. This cognitive dissonance is not merely foundational, it is perennial and defining of American culture and history. And by extension, it suffuses the historical present we now live in and its reality. A fraught reality we examine, interrogate, and teach under the disciplinary rigor of American studies. The cognitive disjunction in the specific case of the United States of America begins, as noted here, in 1776 with the drafting of its founding document, the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. The Harvard historian Jean Lepore, in her voluminous 2018 book, These Truths, A History of the United States, points out that in the second paragraph of his draft, Jefferson originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Benjamin Franklin intervened to revise that sentence to what we now read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The difference between the two versions, Jefferson's original and Franklin's revision, is the kernel of the polar disjunction at the founding moment of the US and its national history. It is a juncture that many years later, in 1915 to be exact, the poet Robert Frost would distill into "The Road Not Taken," the title of his poem, and "The Road Taken," its coda, that is, the poem where the poem says, "It made all the difference." And the variation between Jefferson's and Franklin's renditions, like the roads of Robert Frost's centuries later, in practice converge and clash in intricate, symbiotic, and often violent ways, as happens to be the case in the chaotic year 2025. In 1776, the very year of its composition, the Declaration received its sharpest critique by the iconoclastic English philosopher and jurist Jeremy Bentham in a searing review titled "A Short Review of the Declaration." Bentham's interest in America extended beyond the incipient United States of America. He was a friend of Latin American revolutionary Francisco de Miranda and correspondent of José Cecilio del Valle, Foreign Minister of Mexico during the brief self-declared imperial monarchy of Agustín de Iturbide in 1823. Bentham was much given to the visual, the optics to surveillance, and hence of the panopticon, made more famous by Michel Foucault in the 20th century. He ridiculed both Jefferson's original sacred and undeniable and Franklin's revisionary self-evident assertions. In a caustic phrase, Bentham dismantled the self-validating evidentiary tautologies of Franklin's self-evident, as well as the religiously inflected and righteous, sacred and undeniable of Jefferson's categorical declaration. He said, the underlying principle of the Declaration of Independence was, quote, absurd and visionary, close quote. Its self-evident truths, Bentham said, were neither true nor self-evident. Keen iconoclast and hypervisual, Bentham, who gave posterity the true meaning of supervision with the invention of the panopticon, the omnivisual carceral architecture of oversight and surveillance, could see that the claim of self-evident for any vision says more about the claimant than about what is claimed. As a classically educated utilitarian, Bentham knew that self-evident as claimed in any rational argument is a catachresis, that is, an illogical and, in this case, a biologically impossible paradox, because one thing that the eye cannot see is itself and its own truth. And though athwart of things spiritual, Bentham knew that if the eye is the window to the soul, it reveals as much, if not more, about the seer as what the seer claims to see, especially if the object of its vision is itself. At the heart of the impetus for our founding of the International American Studies Association 25 years ago is this very principle, the responsibility of not condemning America to the illusion of seeing itself, or abandoning America to seeing itself in the echoic reflections of its sycophantic simulacra. We must continue to train our focus on such germinal, self-discrepant junctures in keeping with our task as international Americanists. American studies is a discipline of reading, deciphering, and discerning. We study and teach what is written, what is said, what is done, and we examine their consequences. We reach back to etymologies and primal origins, trace the course of what germinated there, and look at the present and future repercussions of what we glean through our research and scrutiny. The challenges we face in our task as analytical readers are now greater than ever. Nonetheless, our disciplinary commitment must continue to adhere to the rigors of our field of study, and we must cleave to the intellectual probity and personal integrity that define us and our vocation as scholars and teachers. We shall return our focus to that originary disjunction and its relevance to the historical present shortly. For now, visualize, if you will, the figure of a fragile 88-year-old man struggling against the blustery wind and blinding sunlight as he stood at an outdoor podium trying to hold on to the papers that contained his prepared speech for the historical occasion of the presidential inauguration in Washington, D.C. That was the poet Robert Frost on January 20, 1961. The sun's rays reflected off of the wind-blown page of the homily he had prepared for the occasion of the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, making it impossible for him to read his written text. Frost defaulted to memory and to his wartime poem, The Gift Outright. The poem was originally published in the spring of 1942 issue of the Virginia Quarterly. Considered as much the national poet as any other American poet, Frost's automatic recourse under the circumstances spoke not only of his improvisational agility, but it speaks also to the reflexive default position of American history. First, spontaneous oratorical switch becomes emblematic of what defines the fabric of American culture from its earliest colonial era throughout its national history. At the core of that history is the reflexive sense of equivalence between entitlement and entitled deed. That a priori claim to the land first asserted in the opening line of his poem, "The land was ours before we were the land," captures the foundational ethos of America from the earliest colonial settlement down to the present, with President-elect Trump asserting with characteristically exquisite subtlety and diplomatic grace U.S. claims to Panama, to Greenland, to Canada, to the Gulf of Mexico, to Palestine. History tells us that these claims are not trumped-up anomalies. They are, albeit belatedly farcical, foundational and perennial hallmarks of America's history. And the doubly elected Trump is neither a cause nor end result, but the symptomatic characteristic of a historical reality that begins with the divinely elected Columbus, the godly papal missionaries, and the righteous Puritans. That proprietary entitlement asserted its claim to the continent in the far west, the Pacific coast of America, half a century before the English Puritans. In the words of Mark Twain, uttered only half in jest, the pious buccaneers of Plymouth Rock landed on the continent's east coast in 1630. Mark Twain saw the claim in Plymouth Rock and the Puritans. An address he delivered before the New England Society in Philadelphia on December 22nd, 1881. When the English pirate Francis Drake was thwarted in his piratical marauding in the Gulf of Mexico in 1579, he skulked sailing into the Pacific Ocean with the aim of intercepting the Spanish king's Manila galleons laden with the riches of Asia and heading to Acapulco, Mexico, the Spanish Empire's entrepot between the Asian Far East and Europe. Looking east into a wide cove from what the Spanish sailors, some 24 years later, in 1603, were baptized Punta de los Reyes, Drake named the land before him Nova Albion. The Spaniards called the outcrop of land they detected on the 6th of January 1603 Punta de los Reyes because they deemed the land to be a gift to them from the Magi, the three wise men or three kings, Los Reyes Magos, who in the Gospel of Matthew delivered Christmas and New Year's gifts on that day that came to be known as the Epiphany. Drake likewise had exercised a certain proprietary presumption in naming the coastline and beach of Nova Albion. Albion was the Roman name for England, for Britain. The white cliffs that line the beach that now bears his name, Drake's Beach in California, reminded him of Dover Beach in Kent, the coastline that faces the English Channel, which is somewhat less proprietary French called La Manche, the sleeve, descriptive of the shape of the same waterway that washes their north shore. The geographic naming of that Pacific coastline by the English pirate and by the captain of the Spanish merchant ship, Juan Sebastián Vizcaíno, 24 years later, signaled a historic act of entitlement that presumptively sealed the fate of the American continent as marked territory ready for the taking. With their naming of the West Coast and all the land east of it, Drake opened a parenthesis that would be closed some 40 years later when the continent's east coast would be named New England, in the English vernacular this time, not in Latin. That nomination was first made by Captain John Smith in 1616, and 4 years later, when the 1606 Royal Charter of the Virginia Company of Plymouth was reissued in 1620 as the Plymouth Council of New England, a joint stock company, the name New England was made official. With that nomination, the North Continent was captured within the parentheses of Nova Albion on the Pacific Ocean and New England on the Atlantic coast. The parenthetical claim was explicitly sanctioned from sea to shining sea in 1845 with the Declaration of Manifest Destiny, and executed a year later with the Declaration of War by President James K. Polk, consistent with the naming of America's wars. Before and since then, it would be called the Mexican-American War, even though it was not initiated by Mexico. Robert Frost's reflexive default to his poem declaiming possession of the land at the Kennedy inauguration on January 20, 1961, then was simply a reiteration of the proprietary entitlement to a continental geography at a time in America's history when the duality that served as the foundation of a bipolar syndrome was in the throes of acute crisis. Robert Frost had already signaled that polarity more than 4 decades earlier in his 1950 poem that was published in August of that year in the Atlantic Monthly. That poem, titled The Road Not Taken, was included in his first book of poetry a year later, in 1916. One of Frost's most popular works, The Road Not Taken, serves as declarative metaphor for America's history since it was named, even before it was possessed by those who named it, whether English pirates or Spanish merchant mariners. And the final line of Frost's poem, and that has made all the difference, points to the perennial difference between the road America has actually taken and the road it would claim to have taken, and still claims to be taking. Much evidence to the contrary. That is the difference between actual reality and projected image. That differential duality persists as chronic, conflictual incongruity that periodically becomes acute and critical with historical regularity, as was the initial case in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson and Franklin variants, as was the case during the decade of the 1960s in which Frost declaimed his inauguration poem, and as is the case in the shrill, farcical, chaotic, and deadly politics of proprietary triumphalism in 2025. That incongruous dissonance has continued to be the case throughout the 25 years since the beginning of the current century, a quarter century that coincides with the founding and existence of the International American Studies Association. The primary impetus for the founding of IASA in 2000 was precisely to refocus the scholarly and pedagogical discourse of the discipline of American Studies on the actual road taken, rather than falling on the official myths and symbols, the institutionalized imaginaries, and the sanctimonious academic claims of the road not taken. Robert Frost would die on January 29, 1963, 2 years after the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy would be assassinated that same year on November 22. 4 years later, one of the most acute readers of American history, Martin Luther King Jr., would diagnose with keen accuracy and uncanny prescience the irreconcilable contradictions between America's professed ideals and actual reality. In an address whose title is of perennial relevance, certainly relevant today, 2025, Martin Luther King diagnosed the chronic incongruity between American reality, that is, its own taken, and the professed image whose ideals that were not taken, but that served nonetheless and continue to serve as screen or as decoy that occludes or whitewashes, as King would say, aspects of America's actual path and historical vicissitudes. That address was titled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos and Community." It was delivered on August 16, 1967, at the 11th Annual Christian Literature Congress in Atlanta, Georgia. As you will see from what I am about to quote here, King's address offers an uncanny vision, a prescient insight of indisputable relevance today, when artificial intelligence seems to enjoy greater currency over human reason, a time when transactional value trumps every other value, and at a time when the militarized economy is run on borrowed money with an unprecedented level of national debt. It reads, and I quote, "When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A civilization can flounder as readily in the face of moral and spiritual bankruptcy as it can through financial bankruptcy." On April 4th, 1968, that is less than 6 months after delivering that address, Martin Luther King was killed. A murder case that, like the assassination of John F. Kennedy 4.5 years earlier, has never been definitively solved. Martin Luther King's Jeremiah, in his August 1967 address to the Christian Literature Congress, was visionary, especially with regard to computer technologies, optimized economic profiteering, racism, and militarism. Vision and visual culture are indeed integral to America's history, starting with what Jefferson and Franklin deemed truth. Certain truths to be self-evident. But visual culture in the American context has another dimension that blinds American self-perception and the deadly consequences of self-misapprehension. This is starkly demonstrated at a time closer to our own, in October 2011 to be exact, when Hillary Clinton, the US Secretary of State at the time, channeled Julius Caesar and his triumphant boast to the Roman Senate in 46 BC, after he returned from the Battle of Zela of the previous year in what was then the Kingdom of Pontus and is now the northern Turkish province of Tokat. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, declared Caesar, according to the Roman historian Suetonius. Hillary Clinton, with a gloating cackle, proclaimed her rendition of those words. She said, "We came, we saw, he died." Between two television interviews shortly after a visit to Libya and the atrocious murder of Muammar Gaddafi that immediately followed her visit. Seen as a death knell has a long history, and the visual illustration of that phenomenon is cast in stone at the gates of the city of Iznik, the ancient city of Nicaea, just east of Istanbul, where the Council of Nicaea of 325 AD was celebrated in order to legitimize the Holy Trinity of the Christian Church. And incidentally, 2 days ago, the newly elected Pope Leo XIV an Augustinian monk, declared that his first visit outside the Vatican would be to Iznik, to Nicaea, to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. The entrance to that city, Iznik, as some of you might recall, is still guarded by the glaring monumental sculptures of the golden Medusa that flank the city gates. Those who apprehend her gaze turn to stone. A derivation of that myth still might have some of you carrying a blue glass eye in your pocket or your pocketbook, called the göz taşı in Turkish. The petrifying imperative of Medusa's gaze is still visibly operative in the visual culture of Hillary Clinton's America, and just as deadly in the stone-faced brutalities of 2025. The 1960s, like the current decade in the 21st century, was a decade of reckoning, when, to continue with Robert Frost's duality, the road taken and the road not taken, the reality and the projected image converged and clashed, often violently. Until the end of the 20th century, the primary focus of American studies as discipline and as scholarly discourse was predicated on the road not taken. Its focus on what was referred to as myth and symbol in academic parlance. The discursive filters swayed and colored the actual road taken that, in Robert Frost's concluding line of this poem, made all the difference. Today, 25 years after the founding of the International American Studies Association, the state of the world and America's role in it demonstrate the necessity, the inevitability, one could say, of IASA's founding in 2000 and its continued vital role today. And while the optics of image are now more paramount than ever, with image production on an industrial scale and with global reach, with harsh reality of the road taken relentlessly haunts the virtual reality of self-projection and the images it manufactures. In our age of informatics, digital memes, virtual avatars, and social cybersphere, the manufacture and dissemination of images figure among the most profitable industries of the global economy. The industry's efficacy and profitability enrich the media's model, whose economic leverage in the political sphere defines the national and international narratives and institutional formations, governmental and non-governmental, including our own universities, all of which now operate mimetically on a business model dominated by imaging, branding, and marketing, with government and governments now operating principally in the transactional mode. Imaging, visual images especially, ensure that governance is dealt with the transacted just like any other commodity, with cost and profit ratios defining the political culture in which governmental institutions and their functionary cadres operate. Their operations are brazen and blatantly transactional. The only mystery is the disingenuous masquerade of operators whose self-confidence leads them to believe that their bold-faced transparency is sufficient to shield their stratagems from public notice. As early as 1857, Herman Melville portrayed in his final novel, titled The Confidence Man, his masquerade, the avatars of confidence that gave the English language the term con man. Today, in 2025, 168 years later, we have nothing more and nothing less than the rule of confidence man, a plenary convergence of the old cons, the neo-cons, and convicted felons ruling the public sphere and controlling the levers of government. The patriot propaganda and master of image making Edward Bernays alerted us to this eventuality nearly a century ago. He averred, and I quote, "It is not necessary for the politician to be the slave of public's group prejudices if he can learn how to mold the mind of the voters in conformity with his own ideas of public welfare and public service." The important thing for the statesmen of our age is not so much to know how to please the public, but to know how to sway the public. Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power. And Bernays noted a few years later, in the 1930 edition of his book Propaganda, I quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society." In the year 2025, as international Americanists, we are compelled by historic events to reconsider the admonitory question in the title of Martin Luther King's 1967 lecture. That is, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? And we're forced to re-examine the reality of Edward Bernays' notion of an invisible government. We're obliged to revisit these two governing constructs conjunctively, in tandem, dialectically, in counterpart, because in the history of the present, the two converge, and in doing so demonstrate how both are highly relevant. But they're also out of date. King's "where do we go from here" is an eternal question of perennial relevance, certainly, but the optative "or" in his chaos or community is rendered mute by historical reality, because chaos, deliberately engineered or coincidental, is now an integral part of community at the local, the national, and the global levels. And as for Bernays' invisible government, it sounds rather quaint, because what was deemed necessary for deflection and occlusion into invisibility is now in broad daylight, brazen, barefaced, and brutal. In the year 2025, we are witness to the clashing of theories and cataclysmic convergence of Robert Frost, Road Not Taken, and The Road Taken, with no qualms about what difference it makes. That said, there is nevertheless a ray of hope in the statistical ledger of the 2024 presidential elections and what those statistics might bode for the future. Conditioned and sustained by image making, principally visual imaging, the presidential election of 2024 stands as a raw demonstration of unemployed political brutality. The electorate was presented with two stark but mirrored choices: the hypocritical savagery of the Democratic Party, whose candidate claimed to stand for the rights of women and children, but nonetheless provided unyieldingly her support and enablement and full-throated aid, material and political, for the mass killing of at least 40,000 women and children in Gaza alone. For its part, the Republican Party saw no need to vacillate, aiding and abetting authentic brutality and mass killing without any qualms. The election results speak for themselves. Between hypocritical savagery and authentic brutality, the electorate opted for authenticity by the narrow margin of 1.5%. With 63.9% voter turnout, there were 156 million votes cast in 2024. Of those, 77,284,180, or 49.8%, were for Trump. Harris garnered 74,999,166, or 48.3% of the vote. According to the University of Florida election lab, neither candidate was able to beat out the more than 89 million eligible voters who did not vote. In the historic year of 2024, the abstentions of that majority of voters that outnumbered those voting for either candidate could be America's road not taken. The abstention party, if it were a party in a democratic system of government, in effect, should be declared the winner of the election. It might be a case of magical thinking to think that the non-voting majority of the qualified electorate opted to abstain out of conviction that their vote not taken in this instance is a reconfirmation of the ideals of an Enlightenment system of democracy and its oft-invoked ideals. But there are some mitigating realities that bedevil that idealism. The two most commonly adduced explanations for the majority non-vote are, one, that those who abstain from voting in the red states, that is, the more conservative demographic, reasoned that there would be enough electoral votes in the Electoral College to guarantee the victory of their candidate. That assumes that not voting in this case was a rational, calculated decision. And two, a large component of the electorate did not vote because they no longer cared, either out of apathy or because they saw no difference between one party or the other when it came to issues important to them, such as the atrocities of the Middle East and Western Asia, or the endemic and growing inequalities at home. Or they felt that neither party placed the common good of the country above the special interests that kept the elected official and political operatives in power. The latter sentiment may well have been exacerbated since the Supreme Court's decision in 2010 in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, in which an already commodified and monetized system was plunged into an unlimited barter of financialization and transactional dealing that sidelined all pretense of a government of and by the people. The result is perceived as a transformation of democracy from a community of citizens to a society of shareholders, with the notion of one person, one vote having morphed into a system where one has as many votes as the number of shares one holds in the enterprise. This has become obvious in the conferral as a result of the court decision of personhood to individual free speech rights upon corporations. Thus, the measure of one person's or one corporate person's wealth becomes commensurate with the measure of that person's power and political rights. This is starkly illustrated in 2025, the year in which the world's wealthiest man is granted the privilege of exercising the greatest power in the reconfiguring and operations of the government, purportedly for the sake of greater efficiency. The monetization of the American political systems at all levels of government is succinctly revealed in an analysis by the ATF, Americans for Tax and Fairness, a coalition of some 420 organizations that advocate for economic reforms. Their recent report from April 2nd, 2025 states, and I quote, just 100 extremely wealthy families invested $2.6 billion and among more than double that billionaire dollars contributed just 4 years prior. The key verb in the ATF sentence cited is investment. An investment is an expenditure that expects a profitable return. The ATF report is titled, Billionaires Buying Elections. They have come to collect. For critical images of virtue secondly are no longer efficacious and thus no longer considered necessary. The masquerade of Herman Melville's confidence man has been unmasked. Nothing is possessed of any value except as an exchanged value. Everything and everyone has a price, and every act is a transactional act and the object of a deal. The task of American studies scholars, analysts, and teachers has been rendered much simpler and much more difficult at the same time. Simpler because the relationship between image and reality have been inverted, their roles reversed. The triumph of the image and its calibrated and targeted optics that had shattered the fragility of the real has been subverted and overtaken by the violent force of the new brutalist real. The image, whether visual, graphic, pixelated, or narrative, and its simulacra have been consigned to Twitter postings, news bulletins, podcasts, and rebarbative sound bites. The task of American studies has also become more difficult because the obvious, the blatant, the flagrant, and the brazen require a greater subtlety and more intricate tact in being studied, scrutinized, investigated, and analyzed. And those tasks have become subject to greater pressure on the investigator and analyst, so much so that the object of study and analysis vehemently seeks to delimit and determine the method, focus, scope, and nature of the scholarly endeavor and the results of its investigation. It has become obvious in 2024-25 that certain topics, names, terms, and freedom of expression have been circumscribed, surveyed in the classroom, in the press, and in public discourse, notably in highly visible institutional contexts where American studies as a discipline has had a defining historical role. The cases of Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, Brown, University of Pennsylvania, New York University, University of California, University of Minnesota, have been the most obvious examples of thought control, language monitoring, and proscription of political action. The study and teaching of certain topics, nations, religions, ideologies, and state-sponsored acts of criminality and abuse of human rights have been made taboo. Their mere mention criminalized, despite the daily graphic images that document their lawlessness. Their naming has been made unspeakable, both because their mere mentioning triggers rabid vigilantism, blacklisting, denunciation, and persecution, and because their acts are so heinous and their atrocities so horrific as to be unspeakable. The reality of the image, documentary or otherwise, no longer suffices to persuade or to certify what is real, or even if it does, raw power, political and economic, which amount to the same thing in a thoroughly financialized political and educational system, overrides any reality with its own coercive agenda and self-serving alternate reality. In 2025, and the foreseeable future then, American studies must make its way through a minefield, not just figuratively, but for Americanists in certain parts of the world, literally. Faced with the inordinate challenge of the moment, we might do well to remain mindful of the following three things with which I leave you. One, while the reality of the present may be grim, a historical perspective teaches us that politics are mutable, politicians are ephemeral, and the ideological pressures are volatile. Two, we must remain constant in the steadfastness of our commitment to intellectual honesty, professional integrity, and solidarity with the most vulnerable of us, especially with our younger colleagues and our students. And three, no matter the political pressures and economic coercions to capitulate to the brutal reality of the self-interest and the self-convinced, we must not surrender our genuine empathy with the victims of the unspeakable. Thank you very much.
I will not risk that anymore. So thank you very, very much for this beautiful, multi-layered, very complex exposition of the visuality of the political situation, not only of the Americas today, but also of the world as we see it and of the present-day state of the Western culture. And obviously there's 17 pages of notes that I've made during your lecture, so I do have a lot of questions. But let us perhaps, if you allow it, ask the room to raise their hands. And ladies and gentlemen, don't be afraid, please ask questions. Challenge some of the positions that Mr. Jalakadir has presented, because if I monopolize this room, we will never leave. Believe me. Ms. Georgie, talk.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on the last few things that you said about being steadfast, both in terms of freedom of inquiry as well as empathy. I don't know if that also means solidarity towards those first of us who are in more danger than others. I think at this point we're really talking about degrees. And I want to try to get you to take that back to visuality. Maybe I am wrong on this because it's very difficult for me to think this through, but it strikes me that I wonder what forms that our solidarity and empathy could take. And obviously we would want to be, but we don't want to be very specific. Vis-a-vis the visuality, and I think of the visuality as an infrastructure that is being used as a tool by repressive regimes and political forces to actually find, see, look. You were talking about panopticon, you were talking about the Eye in the Lord of the Rings, those kinds of things, to find people who are expressing their solidarity, their being steadfast, speaking out, and picking them off. So what form should our empathy and solidarity and steadfastness should take vis-a-vis the visuality and the uses of visuality?
Well, to begin with, you may have to come see me. You may have to come see me either in Guantanamo or in El Salvador, But we have a very clearly defined task as teachers. And our role, principally, is to make visible in the classroom what might not be discernible to our students, or to teach them how to read. And our solidarity with each other, and especially with our younger cousins, as I said, precisely in what you're doing with the Emerging Scholars Program of IASA, which has become a very, very important dimension of IASA. It's a natural extension of the original agenda, for which, George, by the way, you really should be commended.
Hello, thank you for your speech. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the usage of artificial intelligence and the images of are generated with it, because we have seen that Trump's administration was using started to use these. They make these videos, they make these videos about the possible future of Gaza Strip, or they create images of people being deported, but in a style of cartoons for children. So I wanted to ask about, what do you think is the future of generative AI and the images it creates in the propaganda of such administrations as Trump or other oppressive governments?
Well, we know what imaging means and the complexities of the process of imaging now in the generation of images that can generate images not necessarily for seeing them, but for targeting them. And the most obvious and perhaps the most nefarious consequences of artificial intelligence and its uses have already been deployed in the war on Gaza. A war that is actually being run with image production at Microsoft, Google, and Meta. A war that calculates the targets, not just as targets themselves, but what used to be called collateral damage as expendable and calculated down to individuals, so that if you want to take out the image of a particular target, you calculate you might have to liquidate hundreds of millions in the process. And that would be acceptable. This is not hypothetical. This is not historical. And it is made possible through imaging and through electronic or telecom technology of artificial intelligence and imaging. We have yet to really explore the positive, generative possibilities of that technology, but we have already used its most deadly possibilities.
Ladies and gentlemen, any further questions? Well, I'll ask a very short one and then I'll bog you during the dinner, right? You've used this term authenticity, and it could be either Heideggerian or Nietzschean, but you equated authenticity with blatancy of the Trumpist world, which is totally devoid of any pretense of decency or whatnot, and the inauthenticity of the paradigm that claims to be humanizing politics somehow. That would be the democratic position. How does authenticity and blatancy come together?
Well,
Or visual obviousness.
the most effective or efficient demonstration of authenticity is to claim that it is the reality. And I use the term brutal authenticity in this regard in a paradoxical sense, because it is an authenticity that is blatantly inauthentic.
That's
Inauthentic in the sense that it does not have any sense of what itself is, what its consequences are, and what its repercussions might be on its victims. Nonetheless, it claims to be the real fake. And through imaging and through the political system that runs images, it convinces, persuades the electorate and the public at large that in fact is reality.
So what will Heidegger say to this?
He would say that it is in that faith that it is really inauthentic and that it is extrapolable.
And thereby also moral dubious.
Yes, but morality is so far away from this discourse.
Ladies and gentlemen, any other questions? If not, then I'd like to thank you very much for listening, sir. First and foremost.
Thank you, Professor Khalid. And now we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be here for the presidential panel.